Dear participants, hi. This is Professor Dr. Tuğba Karabulut. Welcome to 41st Science and Society meeting, which is organized by Istanbul Ticaret University. Today, we have a very distinguished guest, Professor Dr. Josh Lerner from Harvard University, Harvard Business School. And we are happy to host him in our webinar. We will be talking about creating new Silicon Valleys. And he'll be also focusing on venture capital, how we can achieve it via venture capital. Welcome, Professor Lerner. How are you?
Very good. Thank you.
And our Vice Rector, Professor Dr. Ömer Çaha, is with us. And he will be making the opening speech. Welcome, dear Hocam.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
The stage is yours, Hocam. Please start.
Thank you so much. Dear colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished Professor Dr. Josh Lerner. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 41st Science and Society meetings organized by Istanbul Ticaret University. Science and Society meetings aim to inform the public on crucial academic and social issues from the scientific point of view. It is very pleasing for all of us that the Science and Society meetings, which started 3 years ago, have reached its 41st program. On behalf of our university, I would like to express my feelings of more than thanks and appreciations to Professor Dr. Josh Lerner, who kindly accepted our invitation and honoring us by participating in this important event. I would like also to express my feelings of thanks and appreciation to Professor Dr. Tuğba Karabulut from Istanbul Ticaret University, who has organized these important events. Professor Lerner is Professor of Economics at Harvard University and works on issues like innovation, entrepreneurship, venture capital, and private equity, and he has a lot of publications on these issues. He also examines policies on innovation and how they impact firm strategies. Professor Lerner co-directs the National Bureau of Economic Research Productivity, Innovation and Entrepreneurship Program, and serves as co-editor of their publication titled Innovation Policy and Economy. He founded and runs the Private Capital Research Institute also. He has been a frequent leader of and participant in the World Economic Forum projects and events. In his speech, Professor Lerner will emphasize the importance of the state in providing venture capital and in attracting venture capital providers to the relevant region for the establishment of ecosystem like Silicon Valley. As I have another program organized previously, I would not be able to follow the whole program. But I fully believe that this program will fill an important gap in its field, and you will have intellectually fruitful and inspiring presentation. As I end my speech, I wish this program to be successful once again, and I send my respect to Professor Dr. Josh Lerner and all participants again and again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, dear Professor Çaha. We appreciate your participation. And welcome again, Professor Lerner. And before we start your presentation, I would like to mention that your research have received more than 70,000 citations. So it's very, very high number. So we congratulate you for that as well. So yeah, you can start. The stage is yours. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Professor Çaha.
Well, thank you very much for the nice introductions. And I very much appreciate the chance to talk here about some of these topics. And clearly these are important issues, and we can see it in many different ways in terms of looking at this. Certainly one way is to look at, just simply the, the volume of venture capital investing when we look worldwide. And we see that really the last few years have seen something really extraordinary, where the amount of venture capital worldwide has really exploded, to, in 2021, close to $1 trillion per year. In last year, which had a bit of a fall, but still was the second biggest year in history with over $500 billion. But perhaps even more significant is the way where this money is being invested. That traditionally, when we look at where venture capital was invested, a lot of it was invested in the United States. It was very much of a US kind of game. And this gives a sense of how things evolved from 2001 to 2022. At the beginning of the period, the blue, the US, represented over 80% of the venture capital invested around the world was in the United States. But then we've seen, and much of the rest of it was in the green, which was the, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. And what one's seen is this, first, this big rise of the red, which is China, where we saw, certainly at one point, the venture capital in China being almost as big as that in the United States. More recently, we've seen the rise of the yellow, which is other developing countries outside of China, which we see has grown very dramatically, particularly in the years since 2017. So what we're seeing today really for the first time is that venture capital really has become not just a developed country phenomenon, but an emerging economy phenomenon. And that certainly raises a lot of hopes and expectations, because the evidence suggests that, certainly within the United States, venture capital, and particularly venture capital in Silicon Valley, has had a huge positive influence. And it's natural to ask the question of, are we going to see the same kind of benefits in emerging economies from this growth that we're seeing in venture activity? So that's in some sense the question. Now, we have to be cautious somewhat, because it's also clear that venture is not always the most uniform of activities. So this is one way to look at it, which perhaps gives a good sense of it, which is an index, a venture capital index based on public stocks. So this is not reflecting the valuations that the venture capitalists put on the companies themselves, but rather reflects the valuations that companies which have recently gone public that were owned by venture capitalists have assigned, right? And as one sees here, you essentially saw between, the beginning of 2000, after a dip with the when COVID hit, this sort of tremendous rise, essentially almost tripling in value in less than a couple of years, and then, a big correction. So there's certainly a lot of volatility that's taken place here, that stocks went up and stocks went down. And certainly there was, during this period, a lot of craziness that took place too. One way to look at this is this phenomenon that we saw in the US and many other parts of the world called SPACs, or special purpose acquisition companies, where one saw, essentially in one quarter in 2021, over $100 billion being raised in SPAC offerings. And yet, when you look at the history of it, the SPACs have been disastrous investments for public investors, really from the beginning of their origins in the 1990s, and yet somehow people became very enthusiastic. So when we look at a picture like this, it's natural to be excited and say, look at all the good things that could be happening here. But when we look at this kind of volatility, we say, how do we get the good aspects of venture capital without perhaps some of the more volatile or problematic aspects that are here? And that's a question today that, we're essentially seeing governments around the world grappling with. On the one hand, there's a lot of eagerness to try to encourage the good aspects of venture capital, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But at the same time, trying to avoid some of the crazy volatility and some of the problems that can be there. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about first, how come venture capital is important? We'll talk then about some of the problems with venture capital. And finally, we'll talk about some of the efforts that we're seeing in governments really around the world, from Australia to Saudi Arabia to Kenya to many states in the United States, to try to promote venture capital and what seems to have been effective and ineffective in terms of that process. So let's start with the good. And in particular, I think one of the things that economists have really come to understand over the last 2 decades is how important venture capital is for innovation and how important entrepreneurship is for innovation. That when you look, for instance, at the 20th century, not the 21st century, but the 20th century, and say, where did the important new ideas come from? A huge number of those in the United States, even though it was the era of big business and corporations and so forth, still came from entrepreneurial companies. That entrepreneurship played an extremely important role in coming up with the ideas, even if the ideas and the companies ultimately ended up getting sold to larger firms. Moreover, it seems that being private is something that can be very helpful. This is from one study that looked at companies that sought to go public and weren't able to, and then looked at how innovative they were from the ones which sought to go public and were able to. And in particular, what the author used was essentially looking at periods when the public markets, after the company filed, had a negative shock, so it was impossible to go public. And what they see is that the companies that stayed private ended up being more innovative in terms of being able to generate more patents and ultimately being more successful in terms of those new ideas. But at the same time, you might say, entrepreneurship is good, private companies are good, but there's a problem, right? And the problem is that many small and young companies have a lot of problems in terms of getting access to resources. And in particular, we know that getting money from banks is hard when you're a small, young company, particularly if you don't have any assets beside perhaps some intellectual property. Angels can be difficult to get funding from because those are just individuals who are giving their own money, and in many cases, they may not really understand things as professionally. We've talked a little bit about the public markets already, and often it's hard as well to get money from big corporations who are suspicious about doing an alliance with a small company. So that brings us to this man, George Dorio, who many people regard as really the father of venture capital. He did many interesting things in his life. He was a professor at Harvard Business School. During World War II, he went to work for the US Army and was basically placed in charge of the supply chain and the logistics for the US Army in World War II in Europe, which obviously was a huge task with a lot of complexity, but basically it worked, right? We won. He founded INSEAD, as sort of the first European business school. But one of the other things he did is set up what many people regard as the first modern venture capital firm. And in particular, when he did this, he was motivated in part, about saying there's some interesting investment opportunities, but his main motivation was really much more about the sense that there was just a huge economic development need for venture capital. And in particular, as we recall, the 1930s had a global recession or depression. And there was a lot of anxiety in general in the United States that after the war, which was, stimulus, that we would see going back to a recession or a depression. And a lot of the concerns were particularly strong in Boston, because Boston before World War II, a lot of the activity had been in industries like textiles and shoes. At that point, they weren't moving to Mexico or Bangladesh, but they were moving to South Carolina. So there was the same kind of, deindustrialization that has become, a common concern around the developed world today. And then his idea was saying, look, there's all these companies around MIT and Harvard, which were developing technology during the war effort. There's a lot of interesting stuff here, whether it's electronics like oscilloscopes or radar and so forth, which is going to have commercial use. But these companies are going to find it hard to get money from banks. They're too small to go public. We've got to find another way to get them funding. And in particular, what he did is he proposed the idea that we would essentially have a financial institution that would spend a lot of time, sorting through companies. In other words, it wouldn't be just like 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 getting funding, but it might be like 1 in 100, that they'd be very involved with the companies they gave money to. And they would also be providing a bit of a stamp of approval so that investment bankers or large companies would be comfortable in terms of interacting with them because they knew they had backing from a major player. And that led to the creation of American Research and Development, which many people regard as the first venture capital firm. And certainly when you look at the historical evidence, his insight that an organization like this would work has been seen in a lot of different ways. One way is to look at financial returns. This is a measure for different vintage years or years that funds were established of what the public market equivalents for these venture capital funds, looking at all venture capital funds, were. And here, essentially, it's a ratio of the venture returns to that of the public market, in this case, relative to the S&P 500. And it asks, how much better did venture capital do? And what one sees is over this period, it ranges by year, but essentially on average, it's been somewhere around a PME of 1.5, which means to say that if public markets return 10% a year, private markets, venture markets return 50% better or 15% a year. So essentially you had very substantial financial outperformance, which suggests that this thing really worked. Not only did it work in theory, but it seems to have worked in terms of innovation as well. This is from a study that Sam Cordham and I did, which suggests that when you look at $1 of venture capital versus $1 of R&D, you see that the venture capital is essentially 3 to 4 times more effective in terms of increasing innovation than the corporate investment is. And we can see this when we look at the numbers of companies in the US as well. So essentially here we're looking at young publicly traded companies. So essentially, companies that have gone public in the last 25 years and asking how many of these were essentially backed by venture capitalists. And what we see from the first bar is that essentially half of the young public companies were venture backed. Now that might not sound impressive, but when you think about it, you say, in most years, we basically have around 1 million companies being started in the United States each year, and about 3,000 companies getting venture capital for the first time. So essentially there's 0.3% of business starts in the United States are venture backed, but that represents half the companies that are going public. When you look at the total R&D, it's even more impressive. What this says is that if you look at R&D by young public companies, essentially almost 90% of it is essentially being done by venture-backed companies. That 0.3% translates into 90% of the R&D by young publicly traded companies. So it's clear that this has had this enormous stamp on the US economy, which has been really, really important by any metric. We could talk for a long time about this. You could certainly look at not only are there more patents, they're more influential. It seems that even if you sort of control for the quality, you're saying maybe the venture capitalists are just good pickers, right? They just pick good companies to invest with. Well, even when you look, there's been a variety of studies that have tried to disentangle how much of this is due to, just simply stock picking, and how much of this is really due to, fundamentally improving businesses. It ends up basically being a story where it seems that even if you control for the companies that they invest in and their quality, more involvement by venture capitalists seems to be associated with more success. So that's the good news. And it's easy to see why governments in Japan or Saudi or Kenya or the US for that matter are really excited about trying to promote venture capital. But there's a problem, there are several problems, in fact, about venture capital that make it certainly not perfect and raise a number of issues. One concern is, saying, all right, a lot of companies are getting funded and they're going public, but is it the right kind of companies that are doing this? And perhaps the most famous capturing of this was Peter Thiel's comment about we wanted to get flying cars, instead got 140 characters, right? That in a way, many of the inventions that venture capitalists have funded seem, with the benefit of hindsight, to be somewhat trivial. We can sort of see this in the data as well. So if you look at, the kinds of companies which are getting funded, a lot of it is in software and business related services. Those are the two things that have really boomed. When you look at the funding, particularly of hardware, and that's the solid line of telecom, networking, computer hardware, energy, and so forth, we see a much smaller growth in terms of activity. More and more of the money has gone into software and services. And in some sense, that's not surprising, because that's where we can see it in the patent data as well, that, essentially it's become very focused on a few areas, mostly which are software related, if we look at the patents by venture-backed firms. And in some sense, that's not surprising, because that's where the money has been. So this is an effort by one of the consulting firms, Sandhill Econometrics, to essentially create an index which says, what would have happened if you had put $1 in to any number of companies, every company that was doing software, every company that was doing hardware, every company that was doing clean tech, and so forth. And the basic answer is that you would have made almost all the money from doing the software investing. That's been extremely profitable, and many of the other areas have had much lower returns as a result. And perhaps rationally, the venture capitalists have shifted to putting more and more money into software rather than to areas like hardware, even if it may be that the bigger social returns would be from that area. And we can think about lots of reasons why that is, but certainly part of it is that software, you can invest a little bit of money and figure out very quickly whether customers like it or not, as opposed to, building a new molecule for a drug, which might cost you $1 billion to get it through clinical trials when you actually learn whether it works or not. Or even worse, building a new semiconductor factory, which might cost you, many multiples of billions of dollars before you produce anything. So as a result, you've had this sort of sense that, that doing the software investing can be a lot quicker and can be a lot more lucrative as a result. This is a point that Elon Musk makes as well when he's talking about hardware. In this case, he's talking about his rockets, but he says, essentially it's easy to make a few prototypes. It's instead, 1,000 or 10,000 times harder to scale up production. And this is a problem in these tough techs like energy or advanced materials or many, many other areas where you run into these scaling problems. With software, you write a few lines of code, it works. If it works for, one user, it's probably going to work for 1,000 users. In hardware, it's often a very different kind of story. This has had all sorts of consequences, and we could spend a lot of time talking about it. I'll just tell one story here to illustrate some of the issue. which is why this has become a big issue in the United States for policymakers, and I think in a lot of other places as well. And in particular, what we've got is an issue around the things like Catiba. Catiba was a company that did and does organic light emitting diodes. What's that? Well, essentially, this is you guys have seen the Samsung phones where the screen folds, right? Or else the computer screens that are curved, right, rather than being flat. Those are OLED. And these guys were an MIT spin out, from professor's lab. A few postdocs and grad students went to start the company under the professor's guidance. They raised a bunch of money from Boston area venture funds. But after investing in this for 6-7 years, the venture capitalists were getting impatient, right? They were like, everything's taking longer, it's more expensive, and so forth. And they got very frustrated with the business. Meanwhile, I think Spark had invested in Twitter and was making a lot of money on software stuff. And the venture capitalists started saying, we're not sure we want to invest in this business anymore. And what ended up happening is that they ended up having to raise money from Chinese investors, corporations. Ultimately, they had to borrow enough money from the Chinese that basically control of the board flipped to them. And the claim, at least, is that post-pandemic, that Catiba plans to move a lot of its manufacturing and its headquarters from the US to China, right? And that's the kind of thing that certainly raises concerns, saying it doesn't seem that the US venture market is great at funding things like this, these complicated hardware that maybe have a lot of long run benefits, but are difficult to fund. I could talk about this for a lot more. I'm not going to, but I will just go to a couple other problems we could talk about. Another issue people raise a lot is that it's very concentrated, right? That there's a few groups who basically end up dominating a lot of the activity that's taking place. And, essentially, basically the top 5% of venture groups are basically responsible for half the investment. So it's not like, even though there are thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of venture firms, there tends to be a very small number of groups shaping the investment process. The final thing, which I hinted at already, is this boom bust cycle, that we tend to go through these periods where, essentially there are relatively few investors, they have really good returns, everyone else sees what they're doing, they rush in, lots of money flows in the market like it did in 2020 and 2021. Valuations go up, there's too much money chasing too few deals. Eventually something happens like 22, where investors lose confidence, money rushes out, then eventually the economy recovers, and then the whole thing repeats itself again and again. So there's enormous amounts of volatility here, which again, if you're trying to rely on this to fund crucial new technologies, you might not like to see this kind of boom and bust kind of pattern. And we can see it going back here, not just in the recent years, but in the early mid 2010s and mid 2000s and late 1990s. We took it back even further. We'd see it in the 80s and 70s and even the 50s. So in a way, there seems to be this cycles here, and they seem to repeat themselves again and again. And as much as everyone says, oh, we're not going to make that mistake again, one sees this pattern repeating itself many different times. So as a result, in periods when venture dries up, one tends to see this flight to safety and just simply a lot less money going into funding, particularly cutting edge kind of stuff. This again is not just a US thing. I just put from the end of the 1990s, the pattern in Europe and Australia. You see exactly the same kind of booms and busts there. And if we did a chart for Brazil or many other markets, we'd see the same kind of pictures. So at the end of the day, we say venture is really important for funding innovations, not just more innovations, but important innovations. But it's focused on relatively few areas. And in particular, it seems to have this boom bust pattern, which is there. And this brings us to the third and final topic, which is what we're seeing today in terms of public policy. And in particular, a lot of governments are looking at their economies and are trying to boost the more modern parts of it and innovation, right? So, if you're dependent like Australia or Saudi historically on natural resources, or if it's more of a economy that's been driven by manufacturing like Japan, policymakers are sitting there and saying, we need to really upgrade our economy and make it more suited for the 21st century. And one of the things that policymakers have increasingly looked at is venture capital. Now, in some sense, this isn't really a new idea. That certainly when you look at the history of Silicon Valley, you see that there was a government program in the 1950s called the Small Business Investment Company Program that many of the early venture firms started as. Eventually there was too many rules and regulations, and when they could raise private money, they switched to doing so. And I think if you look at many of the places that have emerged as venture hubs, like Israel or Singapore or China for that matter, it seems that the role of government has been really important in terms of creating the venture activity that's there. But on the other hand, you can also say that there's lots of examples of money devoted to venture activities that didn't make a lot of returns. And I think you can look across, the European Union for examples of any number of programs that cost billions and billions of dollars and had very little return in terms of the investments. So the question is really, in a way, not whether governments should be encouraging venture activity, but rather how to do it in a way that's effective. Just to sort of illustrate the scale of this is from a recent study we did looking at programs around the world. So we just counted here the number of programs between 95 and 2019 and counted them up. As you see, the winners seem to be Australia, Poland, and Chile as the ones with the absolute number of programs most. But maybe more valuable measure is to look at this in terms of the size of the programs, and particularly normalize them. But this is the size in billions of dollars. And you see, not surprisingly, big countries like the US and China being in dark red, but you also see, much of Europe, including Turkey, being in dark red there. Perhaps another measure you can look at is normalized by GDP and so forth. And again, you see, for instance, Turkey being quite strong there in terms of a lot of government money going to promoting this kind of activity. But in one sense, you can say the programs seem to work. So when we looked at, for instance, patents and say, let's look at how many patents are filed in a given country around one of these policies, one sees that there seems to be a strong positive effect of highly cited patents after one of these programs begins. But this sort of masks the fact that there are some programs that are very effective, as we talked about, the Israelis, the Singaporeans, some of the Chinese programs, and other programs which are much less effective. So the question is, how do you get the good programs and not the good programs? Why is it that some of the programs aren't that good? One of the problems is that in many cases, governments have the right intentions. They want to do the right thing, but they just don't really understand the process. So they end up making a bunch of mistakes, not because they want to, but because they essentially just don't really know how to encourage a venture ecosystem. The other problem that we see around the world is capture, right? Where basically politicians take, this is as true in the United States as anywhere else. They like to take care of their friends, and their friends get the benefits, and not necessarily the people who the program was putatively trying to help. This is from a speech I made right before COVID. I went out to the Davos of Sweden, which is often an island called Gotland, and one of the guys who had sponsored my speech ended up bringing this along. This is way out in the middle of the Baltic Sea. This is a Swedish post office car, and the Swedish government had decided to encourage entrepreneurship by giving a bunch of money to a company to build cars. And in particular, they decided to do it in Lapland on the grounds that, there was not a lot of activity in the far north of Sweden. Needless to say, the cars that were developed were not very good by any means. and the whole program was a huge fiasco. In some cases, these programs not only produce something that's worthless, but they've actually done harm. I think one of the famous examples along these lines was the effort after the global financial crisis as part of the stimulus program that President Obama put in place to try to do funding for clean energy. And basically it ended up handing out a few billion-dollar grants. Not only was there a huge amount of lobbying and you might almost say corruption in terms of people fighting to get these grants, but in many cases, the venture capitalists stopped investing in this area, saying whoever gets one of these grants is going to have such an unfair advantage that we don't want to be investing in one of the other companies because they're almost sure to lose as a result. So what can we say about the effectiveness of programs and how they work? I think there's a few things we can say in terms of what is associated with an effective government program to promote venture capital activity. One of them is a notion that is certainly been embraced by macroeconomists, though not in every corner of the world, which is about the importance of independence, right? So this is a study that our former president, Larry Summers, president of Harvard, Larry Summers, and Alberto Osina, who was in Harvard's economics department, did, looking at the extent of central bank independence and inflation, and basically making the argument that the more independent the central bank is, the less the inflation rate, is. And in some sense, you can say that that principle that I think in most parts of the world is well established for central banks carries over to venture policy making as well. That again, once my rule that I always sort of propose is that you should keep the distance between the politicians and the entrepreneurs as far as possible, and that these things work far better when essentially it's not the flavor of the month, but rather when it has an independent group that does this thing. So, one interesting example here is New Zealand, which had the Venture Investment Fund. And they had some earlier efforts where there'd been a lot of political interference. New Zealand's a very small country with just 4 million people. So everybody knows everyone, and the politicians were interfering. So they basically modeled it after the Canadian pension plan, where in Canada, this pension plan, it's harder to change the board of the pension plan than it is to change the Constitution. They just made a wall around it to give independence to it. In the same way with the venture fund, they sort of created, in New Zealand, they created a wall around it to, not have pressure to do a deal with some, relative of somebody in the New Zealand parliament or, in some fashionable area, but to try to take a long run kind of approach. Another thing that seems to be, really critical in terms of success is the principle of matching funds. When we look at government programs around the world, even if the government officials are extremely intelligent and well-intentioned, it's often hard picking the winners, right? It's essentially you need a deep understanding of what's happening. And one of the things that seems to be very effective, probably most famously illustrated by the Yosema program in Israel, is essentially this notion of saying, let's only give money to people who can raise money from private sources. So essentially, let's validate, any kind of public decisions by, essentially having a market test here in terms of what takes place. And I think when we look at many of the recent programs, they've tried to incorporate this to, some cases very good, others of them less effectively, but with the notion being that they want to, in some sense, create a market test for whether the funding is going on there. As I mentioned, Yosema is a classic example. Prior to it, there had been, in the 1990s, there had been a real reliance on the part of entrepreneurs on bank debt, a lot of suspicion of venture funds. Here, not only did they do matching funds, but they insisted that people raise matching funds from foreign venture groups. And essentially, it ended up really creating the Israeli venture industry. And certainly when you look at many measures of venture capital to GDP, Israel is at the highest in the world in terms of this kind of activity. So when we sort of think about these lessons around public venture capital or public efforts to try to promote venture activity, I think we see several things that stand out. One of which is that you can make a very strong case that government interventions make sense, that in many senses, there are market failures here, and that as we talked about, it may be that the companies which have the greatest social returns are not the ones with the greatest financial returns, and as a result, it's going to be difficult to get these funding. We might also say, booms and busts, where again, there might be all sorts, particularly during busts, a lot of good companies going unfunded that are challenges. At the same time, there is a lot of information gaps, and public officials may have many things they do well, but probably the skill set that is really good for running a set of trains or public works and so forth is very different, the very kind of intuitive skill set that one needs to be a venture capitalist, and particularly making very quick decisions, often without a lot of documentation and data. I think two of the things I emphasize here is that, really thinking carefully is important, and really designing it, particularly with this idea of independence and matching funds, as two key touchstones. And I think, again, we might say, really thinking of saying, where is our comparative advantage? Also often these government programs will, basically go chasing after the same thing that everyone else does. And in a way, it often seems they're far more successful when they've thought carefully and said, where are likely to be areas where we really are different and unique, and we might have somewhat of an unfair advantage as a result. So thank you very much for listening to me. We have, I believe, somewhere on the order of 15, 20 minutes, and hopefully we can spend that with a few questions and discussion around any topics that seem particularly interesting.
Okay, thank you very much, dear Professor Lerner. We have learned a lot about this subject. We appreciate all your efforts. And Recep Ali Hoca, do you have any questions? He's our finance professor.
Yes, thank you, Tuğba Hocam. And thank you, Professor Lerner. Thank you very much, very valuable information. I am coming from the financial industry. I have worked 30 years in stock exchanges of Turkey. And so I have a question to you about venture industry and AI, into artificial intelligence investment. And nowadays is a very hot topic.
Absolutely. It's a great question, and it's got many interesting dimensions to it, right? So certainly in a lot of ways, I laugh because I teach a class at Harvard College, and everyone is 18 or 19, 20 years old. They all want to be entrepreneurs. Last year, everyone was like crypto, and they were starting their crypto DeFi company. This year, they're all starting AI companies. And I think they're reflecting in a slightly crazy pattern what we're seeing in the world as a whole in terms of that. So I think that, clearly there is a bit of a hype cycle right now in terms of all things AI. But at the same time, it certainly seems that unlike crypto, I think it's pretty clear that this is just going to have, a very substantial societal impact, and that the economic benefits from getting this thing right are going to be, that it really is a bit of a early stages of a gold rush, right? And, how it's going to work, who's really going to benefit, and so forth. There's a lot of questions there, but certainly if you're a venture investor, it seems like ignoring AI and its implications would be quite foolish, right? I mean, there are many questions, and certainly one of them is, how much of this is going to be a game that the incumbent firms are going to win, right? We've certainly seen new firms like ChatGPT, but we've also seen, companies like, Amazon, but especially Google and to a certain extent, Apple here in the States, Microsoft, putting huge investments in and trying to harness the AI to their own platform. And I'm sure if we were to look at what Alibaba was doing in China, it would be much the same kind of thing. So there is a question here, unlike social media, where it seemed like the old media companies really weren't terribly successful, and it really opened the door for a whole series of new firms. Will this be the kind of investment or kind of area where it's going to reinforce the existing players, or are new players going to be able to get get and hold on to a substantial share? The other really interesting question here is, what are the implications for investment? And in particular, we know that there have been a bunch of experiments in the past, including one that was pretty well publicized by Google, to try to bring some of the AI tools into the investment decision-making process. And, could AI be as smart as a venture capitalist in terms of making decisions? Presumably, there's a lot of data to crunch and patterns to recognize. At the same time, it's fair to say that, doing successful venture investing is very different from, playing chess or Go or something like that, right? Where there's a very clear rules. In some sense, when you think about, the best venture capitalists, they're almost more like artists than engineers, right? Sort of putting together, very vague kind of ideas and then bringing them together in very creative kind of ways. And you can imagine that that's an area that the computer is going to struggle somewhat with in order to, really be able to be effective at it. So I think there's a lot of really interesting questions here. And I think that certainly, not only from the perspective of academics, but from the perspective of real world, both AI and as an investment area, and AI and its implications for investment are going to be an area with a lot of thought and discussion in the years to come. So it's a great question.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Küçükçolak. I appreciate. Thank you, Professor Lerner. Okay, Jacobo, do you have any question? Would you like to ask something?
Yes, Professor. It was a quite an interesting intervention here, and there's a lot of questions, so especially regarding the investments on the area of artificial intelligence. I've had some information about what happened between Samuel Altman and Elon Musk.
Right.
So, while launching the OpenAI project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. And, in a way, it's interesting that you see the same smart guys appearing again and again, right, in these very different technologies. And I guess part of that is, in a way you say, what makes a great venture capitalist or a great entrepreneur? Well, in part, it's that you're very intelligent. In part, it's also that you're in the network, right? And you're getting all this information from all these different sources and hearing it well before anyone else. In some sense, this has been always the challenge, right? In a way, I remember, one of my friends, he had a venture fund down in North Carolina, and he went to try to raise money from Harvard, and the Harvard endowment said, well, and he was like, oh, North Carolina's got lots of innovation going on and so forth. And they were like, yeah, Red Hat is a famous open source company that started in North Carolina. And he was like, and the guy from Harvard management was like, did you invest in Red Hat? And he was like, no, I didn't, but I really wish I could, but it shows how great opportunities there are. And basically the guy from Harvard management, who was a little bit obnoxious, said, well, I invested in it because there was basically a Boston firm that invested here, right? So in a way, the Boston firm, even though they were 1,000 miles away from North Carolina, figured out that Red Hat was an exciting company and invested in it before anyone else could figure it out, because they just simply had such a great network to identify opportunities. And in a way, this is certainly one of the challenges of venture capitalists, right? That you can go and start a firm in Kazakhstan and raise some money to do it, but are you going to be hearing as much about where opportunities are than, Sam Altman or Elon Musk sitting in Silicon Valley or in Austin and just hearing all this stuff, right? That the informational advantage is really, really huge. And it certainly gives a sort of unfair advantage to the established players in this industry. So, you know, I certainly think that the OpenAI story is a really fascinating one, but it sort of does illustrate some of the ways in which it is, you know, sort of the power of information and being able to recognize things before everyone else is quite fascinating.
Yes, definitely, Professor, because the entrepreneur, most of the time you mention like are oriented more about the on the innovation side of their project, and also some of them, like Sam Altman, accord more importance on social return. But for the side of the investment, they will be more oriented on the financial return. So this can create like an area of conflict between.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we think about some of the issues I talked about briefly, you know, in terms of, you know, some of the challenges of financing tough tech, it really gets to this, right? You think about an area like clean tech, you know, there was a sort of long period, you know, for most of the 2010s where venture capitalists wouldn't invest in clean tech at all, even though clearly it had, you know, enormous social importance because of, you know, global warming and so forth. And why was that? Because they did a bunch of investments in the first decade of the 2000s and lost an enormous amount of money. So it was one of these instances where you had, on the one hand, something which obviously had very high, you know, potential social returns, but where the lowness of the financial returns were such that it really discouraged investors from coming in. So a great set of points.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Yakuba. Thank you, Professor. Özgür Bey, do you have a question? Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, please, Tuba Hocam. Good day, sir. I am one of the PhD students in the university. Thank you very much for the webinar today. As you mentioned, venture capitals basically support software startups. On the other hand, there are opportunities in high-tech or deep tech startups, especially in defense and aviation. How can these startups reach venture capital more effectively?
Yeah, well, this is a question which doesn't have an easy answer, but it is something where there is, the good news is there's a lot of experimentation going on today. I think, you know, historically, you know, there's been any number of barriers to the investment in this area. I mean, certainly one of them has been as we talked about, the time and cost to develop information, not only just, you know, the product, but also information as to whether it's going to work or not, right? In a way, the venture capitalist mantra is always that it's not that you're not going to, you lose money, but when you lose money, lose only a little bit of money. And when you get something which is good, invest a lot and you make a lot of money on it. And, you know, deep tech and certainly defense tech is generally not conducive to those kind of approaches. So another challenge has been that even when the government has tried to help, it often has been very difficult to, you know, basically be able to do business with the government as an entrepreneurial company. And this is certainly true in the United States. Maybe we're the worst, but this is a more general problem that, you know, government procurement processes are very complicated. Often there's a, you know, a political element to them, or, you know, a relationship element to them. And as a small startup, it's very hard to get, even if you have something that would be very useful for the defense community, it's often, or for that matter, energy or many other areas of government, it's often very hard for these companies to get in the door. So where we've seen innovation now is in terms of people trying to figure out ways to essentially tap into the startup insights and to get them into the system without all the complexities associated with the traditional procurement process. You know, certainly, you know, some of the efforts within the US would be efforts like InQtel that a number of the intelligence agencies run. Another example would be DI/UX, which has tried to again do, sort of simplified procurement processes. And we've seen echoes of these kinds of programs in other countries, which are trying to, in some sense, lower the barriers to getting financing to these young companies. We've also seen, dedicated incubators like the Engine here in Cambridge, which again are sort of set up for these kinds of businesses. But I do think that it remains a substantial problem because just simply the venture is very good at doing, it's a model that's worked really well doing one thing extremely effectively. And the challenge is, how do you adjust the model or tweak it in a way that allows it to, capture a lot of these positive features without, sort of while preserving many of the good aspects of it. I mean, I think another, illustration of this problem has been efforts by corporations to set up venture programs. Many companies in many different industries have come to the conclusion that they're not that great at financing businesses themselves, financing things in their R&D lab, or even though they finance them, they can't commercialize them. So they've tried to create programs to try to tap into, entrepreneurial innovation by trying to get access to young companies. But again, they run into all sorts of issues, not the least of which is that, it's often hard to transfer the knowledge in the company. There's a lot of resistance to the discoveries. It may be that the decision-making in the company is much more political. People may not be paid the right incentives in the corporation, right? So in a way, I think one of the really exciting areas of innovation is to sort of say, how do we take aspects of venture capital that work really well in the traditional model and then move them over to areas like, government innovation or corporate innovation, and try to adjust the model in a way that keeps the good stuff, but allows it to solve some other sets of problems. I think this is a complicated area. It's certainly challenging, but it's certainly one which is, very exciting and intellectually interesting as well.
Thank you, sir. It was very comprehensive.
Thank you very much. I have a quick question. What might be the quick tips for Turkey to accelerate the use of venture capital? Because it's not widely used in Turkey right now. So what could you suggest to us, to the maybe Turkish government and other organizations in the financial sector?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that sort of jump to my mind as being particularly important. One of them is clearly the sense of saying that rather than rushing to hand out money to startups, which is often where many governments like to start, taking a really critical look at what the barriers to entrepreneurship are there, particularly for high potential entrepreneurs. That, in many cases that's more complicated because there you run into issues around, taxes and, labor regulations and many other areas, which are a lot, in a way, it's a lot easier for a government official to just hand out a check. I think around the world, they love handing out checks to entrepreneurs than dealing with some of these more structural kind of problems. But I think we've seen again and again that if you don't address the sort of, what I call setting the table, it's unlikely to be successful no matter how much effort, how much money gets pumped into the ecosystem in terms of direct grants. I think another thing I would very much emphasize is the importance of time frame. I think one of the things we've seen in many countries is the impatience to get quick results. In many, I think, when you look at the experience of Israelis or Singaporeans or whatever, right, they spend, well more like 10, 15 years really building up the entrepreneurial system till they got substantial results. And in a way, one needs to really have this sort of long run perspective in terms of doing that. I don't think that always works, right? I mean, leaders often are impatient and want to show results quickly, and this is very much a long run investment. And having that sort of long run perspective is clearly really essential in terms of success here.
Okay. Thank you very much. And last question, what might be your suggestions for researchers who conduct research in the field of entrepreneurship? What might be the emerging,
Right.
subjects for further studies?
Well, there's so much we don't know. And I think I would begin with where I started, which is the fact that the venture capital literature has reflected, the historical patterns of venture capital, which is to say it's really focused on the United States and to a lesser extent, Western Europe. And in a way, what we've seen this sort of explosion in terms of not just simply activity, but in terms of policies in other places, in understanding what works and what doesn't work, both in terms of just the private sector institutions themselves, as well as public policy in many of these other economies, is, I think, a huge open issue, which has a lot of room for exploration. And I think it's also just exciting. I mean, clearly, one of the reasons why people focus on the United States is there's lots of data there, right? And high quality information. And, in many other economies, the quality of data and the length of it is not as good. But I think this is an area that's enormously exciting. And, we've tried to do, some cross-country comparative studies, but you could imagine there's also opportunities to do deep dives on individual programs and really understand how they work, where are the barriers, and how can one get some interesting insights from the way that programs are designed. So those would be a few thoughts.
Thank you very much. We appreciate all your efforts, and we are happy that we met with you. We had a chance to meet with you, and please keep in touch with us. We would like to see you in our university whenever you have time. So you are always welcome to come to our university, to Istanbul. We'll be more than happy to host you. And also, I would like to thank to all participants for their valuable contributions. And maybe in the future we can conduct a joint, research in the field of venture capital and entrepreneurship, and maybe we can have a comparative, study for Turkey and US. So thank you very much, dear Professor, once again. We appreciate all your efforts.
Thank you very much. Very much enjoyed it.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.